Welcome back to Steel City Sports. So today is Mock Draft 3.0 on the channel, and I'm really excited for this mock draft because it's the first time that I'm going to be doing the entire first round. In our first two mock drafts, I only did the top 10 picks. Now that I've done more research, I've looked at like 1,000 different mock drafts. I actually feel very confident in talking about these guys, giving my takes on all the guys that have first round grades. So keep in mind, I'm not really a big college football guy. I definitely watched a lot more this year. I definitely consider myself more of an NFL guy, 100%. But I love the draft process. I always get into the draft this time of year, so I'm really excited. Buckle in for a long one. We're going to be talking about the entire first round of the 2024 NFL Draft. With the first overall pick, I have the Chicago Bears drafting Caleb Williams, quarterback from USC. I know, what a big surprise. For me, this has been a no-brainer for over a year now. After Caleb Williams' Heisman year, I think he cemented himself as a once-in-a-decade generational level quarterback talent. So no matter who holds the number one overall pick, no matter who else is in the draft, anytime you are that level of a prospect at that position, you are going first overall. I had a lot of arguments with the Bears fans, them all calling me morons that I thought Caleb was going to be. They were going to take Caleb over Justin Fields, and now that's clearly evident. For me, it was never a quarterback controversy. For me, there was never a doubt in my mind that they were going to go with Caleb Williams over Justin Fields, and they've now really built up one of the best landing spots, I think, in the history of the NFL. You could argue this is the best landing spot for a number one overall pick. You just look in the past couple of years at some of the dumpster fires that number one picks have gone to. Think of Joe Burrow going to the Bengals, how bad they were for decades. You think of Jacksonville when Trevor Lawrence got there and what a laughingstock they were. You look at Caleb Williams now going to a team that has a legit defense, that has an ascending offensive line, that has two legit number one wide receivers. They signed DeAndre Swift, a really good running back. So there's a lot to work with here, and I think Caleb Williams is going to hit the ground running in Chicago. With the second overall pick, I have the Washington Commanders selecting Jayden Daniels, quarterback from LSU. And I get it. This might be a controversial opinion because it feels like Drake May has been QB2 in this class for about a year now. But for me, Jayden Daniels' physical attributes, I just can't pass on that if I'm the Commanders. You look at his athleticism, his ability to get out of the pocket and be a pure playmaker. He just provides that wow factor that I don't think Drake May has. You know, Drake May is a phenomenal quarterback prospect, but he's no Jayden Daniels. Jayden Daniels is an absolute playmaker, and I think he fits in perfectly with Cliff Kingsbury's offensive philosophy. You know, you look at who Cliff Kingsbury had as a head coach, Kyler Murray. You know, he wants to run that style of offense, the free-flowing, allowing the quarterback to get out of the pocket and play make, and I think Jayden Daniels showcased that he could do that at LSU. If I'm the Commanders, I just cannot pass on the physical traits that Jayden Daniels provides as a quarterback prospect. With the third overall pick, I have the New England Patriots taking Drake May, quarterback from North Carolina. So this might be a bit of a controversial thing, putting him at 3, because I know for basically a year now he's been QB2 in this mock draft. But for me, I think Jayden Daniels has higher upside, not only from an arm standpoint, a playmaking standpoint, but also athletically. And we're seeing how important that is now becoming in today's NFL. The quarterback's ability to get out of the pocket, scramble, play make. I think Jayden Daniels does all that stuff better than Drake May. And, you know, this is even a bigger narrative. Like, outside of Caleb Williams, I think all these quarterbacks, it's 50-50 if they're going to work out. You know, Caleb, I'm 100% sure is going to be a star in the NFL. The rest of the quarterbacks in this class, half of them are probably going to suck. And Drake May's one that kind of worries me because there's no wow factor with him. You know, some of these other quarterback prospects, they really have something that really impresses me. Like Jayden Daniels is an absolute playmaker. Michael Penix might have the best raw arm talent in the class. Like for Drake May, he's good. He's had some great performances at North Carolina. But for me, he doesn't have that one wow factor that makes him stand out. And I just think Jayden Daniels in specific, it just has undeniable physical characteristics that I would gamble on more than Drake May. So I think Drake May is going to be good in the NFL, but I don't see him as like a superstar franchise building block guy, and he's going to one of the most rough situations in the NFL with New England. With the fourth overall pick, I have the Arizona Cardinals drafting Marvin Harrison Jr., wide receiver from Ohio State. So I know that it has been heavily rumored that the Cardinals might actually trade this pick. They've even come out publicly and said we're open for business. But as someone who's a massive Kyler fan, you know, Kyler is probably my favorite non-Steeler in the NFL. So I'm a big Kyler guy. I really just hope they draft this guy. Like, to see them trade down, like, yeah, you can make the team more well-rounded, but when you have such a dynamic quarterback like Kyler Murray who can single-handedly win you games, even showed this past year, he single-handedly won the Cardinals games. Even though their roster has a lot of holes, it makes a lot of sense to trade down. I just think it makes more sense to go with Marvin Harrison Jr. because we saw when Kyler Murray had an elite weapon, when he had DeAndre Hopkins, they were one of the most prolific duos in the NFL, and Kyler Murray was widely regarded as a top 10 quarterback in the NFL. When he had DeAndre Hopkins in his prime, they made the playoffs when they had that duo, so I think it's really important to go out there and get Kyler Murray a true number one receiving weapon, especially after losing Hollywood Brown. Like, who are the receivers on the Cardinals now? I don't even know. So Marvin Harrison Jr., I just think it makes too much sense. And if you trade down, like let's say they trade down with Minnesota, which I see mocked a lot, that puts you out of range to get any of the big three wide receiver prospects. So I would hate that for Arizona as a Kyler fan. I'd hate to see them trade down. It just makes the most sense to take Marvin Harrison Jr. I think he's the most pro-ready of the wide receivers. We saw him dominate at Ohio State for years now, and I think he's going to walk in and already be a Pro Bowl level wide receiver as a rookie. With the 5th overall pick, I have the Los Angeles Chargers drafting Malik Nabers, wide receiver from LSU. Now, similar to that Cardinals pick, this has been one to be heavily rumored for them to be trading down. I don't think it should happen. I know Harbaugh usually doesn't prioritize wide receivers, but you look at how thin the receiver depth is on this Chargers team after cutting Mike Williams, after trading Keenan Allen away to the Bears. Right now, your wide receiver number one is Quentin Johnston, who a lot of people think is a bust. So you cannot go into next year with that guy as your number one weapon. Malik Nabers, I think, is NFL ready. Some people think he's even better than Marvin Harrison Jr. I wouldn't go that far, but he could be just as good, honestly. Like, there is a world that exists where he is that good. And another thing is, like, the teams that would be looking to trade up to 5 would be Denver and Minnesota sitting at 11 and 12. Well, look at the teams in between there. Why would they have to trade all the way up to 5? Let's just go through it real quick. 6 is the Giants. I don't think they're drafting a quarterback. They're paying Daniel Jones $1 billion a year. 7 is the Titans. I guess they could take JJ, but for me, it looks like they're kind of embracing Will Levis as their guy. 8 is Atlanta. They're not drafting a quarterback. They just signed Kirk Cousins. And 9 is the Bears, who are taking Caleb. So for me, it makes a lot more sense for one of those teams to jump up to 9, where the Bears could move down to get more. And that would make a lot more sense for the teams to move up to just 9, because you're going to be giving up a lot less going up to 9 than you would be for 5. So I think the Chargers are ultimately going to get stuck, because I don't think the teams need to go up that high, and they're ultimately just going to go with the best player on the board. The player that fits the most for this team is getting a weapon. Everything I just said about getting Kyler a number one weapon, it's just the same for Justin Herbert. You got to get that guy a playmaker, and Malik Nabers, I think, can be a day one star in the NFL. With the 6th overall pick, I have the New York Giants drafting Rome Odunze, wide receiver from Washington. So yeah, that's now 3 wide receivers in a row off the board, but that just shows you how valuable the position is in today's NFL. You know, quarterback's obviously the highest paid. Defensive edge is probably the 2nd highest paid, but I'd say wide receiver is probably the 3rd highest paid position in today's NFL. All the roles are slanted to the offensive side of the ball, so it makes sense for all these guys to go in the top 10. And I honestly don't think the gap between the 3 top receiver prospects is that big. I think it really comes down to nitpicking whenever you rank them out. Rome Odunze is a big-time playmaker, especially those big bombs down the field. That's why we saw him and Penix be one of the best 1-2 punches in college football this past year. He is an absolute superstar playmaker. I think he's going to be a stud in the NFL. That's why it sucks to do this to him, to put him on the Giants, because I think the Giants are actually going to be in the running for the worst offense in the NFL this next year. I think it's going to come down to the Giants, the Patriots, and the Panthers. One of those 3 teams are going to be the worst offense in the NFL this next year, because you look at how drastically bad the Giants were last year. At least they had Saquon Barkley for most of the year. Like, now you take Saquon off, who was their only legit offensive playmaker. The Giants on offense are going to be dreadful to watch. So I hate to do this to Rome, to put him on this team, but I just think it makes too much sense. You know, they're desperately lacking an offensive playmaker. You can argue they have the worst wide receiver core in the entire league, so they desperately need a wide receiver. In a perfect world, I'd have them taking a quarterback, but just where it stands, the amount of money you're paying Daniel Jones, it doesn't really make realistic sense to take a quarterback here. So I have them going receiver with Rome. With the 7th overall pick, I have the Tennessee Titans drafting Joe Alt, offensive tackle from Notre Dame. This one feels like a no-brainer. This is one that I'm the most confident in outside of Caleb Williams because you look at the Titans roster, their biggest glaring need is offensive linemen. So if they have the chance to draft the best offensive lineman prospect, it's a layup. It's a no-brainer, and I think he is going to be a phenomenal player at left tackle for the Titans. You look at some of like their other big needs, they already kind of addressed that in the offseason, getting L'Jarius Sneed, getting Calvin Ridley, getting Tony Pollard. Like, they've had a really good offseason, and I think they're just going to add that by getting Joe Alt. He feels like the missing piece for that offense. Like, you got good receivers, you got a nice running back tandem. Obviously, ultimately, it comes down to can Will Levis play, but right now, it looks like they're doing everything to give him the best shot possible with the receivers they've given him, with the good running back tandem that he now has, and now getting him Joe Alt to protect his blind side, I think is going to be the missing piece. And I think the Titans, if you've listened to some of my other videos where I was ranking like all the teams, they're my dark horse this year because they're at 5.5 wins. I think that's kind of crazy. I think they're going to be a lot better than that. I could see them even squeaking into the wild card, and Joe Alt would be a massive reason for that. With the 8th overall pick, I have the Atlanta Falcons drafting Dallas Turner, linebacker from Alabama. I know he's listed as a linebacker. I think of him more as an edge. It doesn't really matter if he plays outside linebacker or if he's on the defensive line. He's a pass rusher, and that's ultimately what the Atlanta Falcons need. Dallas Turner, I think, is going to be an NFL-ready player on day one. You look at his production with Alabama this past year, putting up 10.5 sacks, leading the Crimson Tide. I think he's a ready-now player. I think he's the best prospect on the defensive side of the ball in this year's class. And you just look at Atlanta, after getting Kirk Cousins at the quarterback position, like their only glaring need is their pass rush needs bolstered. So Dallas Turner, for me, is a no-brainer at 8. We have our first trade of the video with the Minnesota Vikings moving up to the 9th overall pick to draft J.J. McCarthy, quarterback from Michigan. I think ultimately it's going to come down to the Broncos and the Vikings. I think they could get into a bidding war over J.J. McCarthy, and ultimately it's just going to come down to what team do they find. I, in this scenario, obviously have them trading with the Bears, and maybe you can make an argument that the Bears, they're not going to want to help their in-division rival Vikings land their next quarterback, and maybe that would sway them to take the Broncos deal a little more. I don't know, but I think on paper it just makes a lot of sense for both sides here. The Bears, they got a really nice, well-rounded roster. I think they can just add to that, get more assets. You're already getting Caleb. You already kind of addressed your big problems this offseason. And then for the Vikings, like, they have a win-now team on offense. You got T.J. Hawkinson, top 3 tight end in football. You got Justin Jefferson, arguably the best receiver in football. You just brought in Aaron Jones, I think still a top 10 running back. Jordan Addison had a great rookie year. Like, there's a lot in Minnesota to set up a young quarterback for immediate success, not to mention Kevin O'Connell, one of the best offensive minds in football. So I think it's a no-brainer, and I think whatever quarterback lands is going to have a massive advantage over some of the other rookie quarterbacks just because there is so much there on that offense. So J.J. McCarthy, I think, makes a lot of sense if they're able to get him. With the 10th overall pick, I have the New York Jets drafting Brock Bowers, tight end from Georgia. So This ultimately comes down to the fact that the New York Jets are completely all in on this next season. That's basically their window is next year, maybe 2 years, but with Aaron Rodgers at that age coming off that injury, I think next year's really their window, and they've made some moves this offseason to kind of hint that they're in that mode, signing some veteran offensive linemen like Morgan Moses, obviously Tyron Smith, bringing in Mike Williams from the Chargers. Like, these guys are win-now type players. They don't have a very long window. So you could definitely argue that the Jets have bigger needs than tight end. Like, if they were looking at this pick from a long-term standpoint, I think offensive line would make a lot more sense. However, if your window is next year, you want to just get the best player available. You want to get a win-now, impactful player, and Brock Bowers can do exactly that. I think he's the best tight end prospect since Kyle Pitts. I think he's actually even a better prospect than Kyle Pitts. I think he's more well-rounded than Kyle Pitts. And Aaron Rodgers historically doesn't really get along with younger players, but Brock Bowers to me feels like an immediate impact NFL level guy. You just add to that weapon core that they're starting to build up. Like they already had Garrett Wilson, they got Mike Williams, now you add Brock Bowers to the mix. It just makes a lot of sense for the Jets that are completely in a win right now mode. So like we said, we had the Bears moving down to the 11th overall pick in the trade with Minnesota. So with the 11th overall pick, I have them drafting Jared Verse, defensive end from Florida State. This one makes a lot of sense to me. Some people actually think Jared Verse is the best defensive prospect in the class. You're certainly entitled to that opinion. I still think it's Dallas Turner. I think he's a bit more refined, a little more NFL ready, but Jared Verse is a freak athlete, posted 9 sacks this past year with the Seminoles, and it makes a lot of sense for the Bears to go defense here because they've already invested a lot on the offensive side of the ball this offseason, getting Keenan Allen, getting DeAndre Swift. Obviously, they're going to be drafting Caleb Williams, so I think their offense is honestly really coming together. Like, if you really want to nitpick, I think you could definitely talk me into offensive linemen here, but I just think the fact that they've put so many resources on the offensive side of the ball, they're going to be looking to add defense here. We know they have a defensive culture, they have a defensive head coach, so they're going to be looking at some of these top prospects, and I think Jared Verse makes a lot of sense here to pair him with Montez Sweat. I mean, that would be a destructive, just hell, that would be hell for opposing quarterbacks to go up against those two guys on the same line. I just think it makes a lot of sense for the Bears to take Verse here. With the 12th overall pick, I have the Denver Broncos drafting Michael Penix Jr., quarterback from Washington. And I get it. There's a lot of red flags with Michael Penix as a prospect. People like to bring up his health concerns. They don't bother me quite as much because it's been 2 years now since Michael Penix Jr. got injured, so it's been a while since that's really played a factor for him. People like to bring up how stacked his roster was. He had the best offensive line in the country last year. He had a great receiver core, obviously, with Rome Odunze and some other guys. So people like to talk about that a lot, but I don't really ever hear them say the pros of him as a prospect because I think he is a phenomenal prospect. I think, honestly, he might have just the best pure raw arm talent out of all the quarterbacks, including Caleb Williams. He might have just a better pure deep ball ability than Caleb Williams. So for that alone, he intrigues me as a prospect. I think he's underrated as an athlete because, yeah, people like to bring up his lack of getting out of the pocket, but like we just said, he had a great offensive line. He wasn't really asked to get out of the pocket, and when given a clean pocket, the guy can cut the opposing team apart. So I really like Michael Penix as a prospect. Denver clearly needs a quarterback. You can't run in the next couple of years with Jarrett Stidham as your guy, and we know that Gary Payton has had some success with developing quarterbacks. He really helped turn around Drew Brees' career when he got to New Orleans, and there is some similarities with Michael Penix Jr. and Drew Brees. The fact that they're not the most mobile of guys, the fact that they both have really good accuracy and clean pockets. So I really like this pick a lot for the fact that Michael Penix, I think I'm a lot higher on him as a prospect than most people. And Denver desperately needs a quarterback, and he's the best quarterback available at this spot. They want to trade up for McCarthy, but if the Vikings jump that there, Penix would be their next best option. With the 13th overall pick, I have the Las Vegas Raiders drafting Bo Nix, quarterback from Oregon. And yeah, that's back-to-back quarterbacks now. This just makes a lot of sense. The Raiders, they've got some talent. They got some really nice high-end pieces. Devontae Adams, I still think is a top 5 receiver in the NFL. Obviously, Max Crosby. They just stole Christian Wilkins from the Dolphins. So they definitely have some good players. They brought in Gardner Minshew at the quarterback position, which is obviously a massive upgrade over Jarrett Stidham. So I think if you draft Bo Nix, you can sit him this year. Let Gardner Minshew be the starter this year, and then next year you can, have Bo Nix come in at the helm. You don't need to throw him out there instantly. And people think like Michael Penix and Bo Nix could go potentially like in the second round. I don't see that. With how many teams there are this year that are just desperate to get a quarterback. We've seen multiple draft classes where quarterbacks just shoot up the board simply because they're quarterbacks, and that just, for me, it doesn't make sense why people have Penix and Bo Nix going in the second round. It's just too valuable of a position. For Bo Nix specifically, though, as a prospect, I just don't know. He's the one where I really don't have a strong take on. I could really see it going like 50-50, honestly, because there's definitely some positives to him. He was really good this year, of course, but the thing that worries me is it just took so long for him to really become like a really good quarterback prospect. His time at Auburn, he was not good. And he also has the most starts in college football history. So it's like, okay, well, you should be good if you played that long in college. It's like you got plenty of time to develop as a college quarterback. Now, you could say similar stuff about that, like Joe Burrow. He played a lot of years in college football as well. So I'm not really necessarily saying it's a negative against Bo Nix. It's just I don't know if it was a product of right place, right time. You know, he's been in college football a lot, so he finally got 1 year to click. Or is he actually has he really developed as a quarterback who can play the position in the NFL? I don't know. But for the Raiders, it makes sense to take a chance on the quarterback position here at 13, for me at least. With the 14th overall pick, I have the New Orleans Saints drafting Olu Fashanu from Penn State. So if you watched my first two mock drafts, in both those mock drafts, I had this guy going to the Jets in both of those at 10. However, I think the Jets have already kind of addressed their tackle position, at least short term. And that's all the Jets really give a shit right now about is the short term because of Aaron Rodgers. So I think he drops out of the top 10. I think the New Orleans Saints makes a lot of sense for this guy because Ryan Ramczyk has been an incredible tackle for them ever since they drafted him, but he's kind of shot now with all the injuries, so this makes a lot of sense. And in terms of him as a prospect, I still think really highly of him. You know, it wasn't that long ago, just a couple years ago, people thought he was going to be the first tackle off the board back in his great year in 2022. I know he had a bit of a rocky 2023, but I still think he has the upside and potential of Joe Alt, so it makes a lot of sense here for the Saints to grab him. With the 15th overall pick, I have the Indianapolis Colts drafting Brian Thomas Jr., wide receiver from LSU. We've been seeing Brian Thomas Jr. shoot up draft boards for like the past month now, and it really just shows how valuable that wide receiver position is in today's NFL to have 4 receivers go in the top 15. But I really think he's going to go in this range, and it makes a lot of sense for the Indianapolis Colts to take him because they're extremely thin at the wide receiver / playmaker position. You know, I like Michael Pittman, but in an ideal world, he's probably like your number 2 receiver. So to go out there and get another potential really good Pro Bowl level receiver to just surround your young franchise guy, Anthony Richardson, it makes a lot of sense to get him another weapon. And this guy, Brian Thomas Jr., I think honestly, it's just for the fact that he played with Malik Neighbors, or he probably would have went even higher because he could have been a number 1 receiver on plenty of the blue blood college teams. It just so happens he played with another freak wide receiver in Neighbors. So I'm really high on him, and it makes a lot of sense, like I said, for the Colts given their lack of depth at the position. With the 16th overall pick, I have the Seattle Seahawks drafting Laiatu Latu, defensive lineman from UCLA. I'm sorry if I just butchered his name, but I think this pick makes a ton of sense. You look at Seattle's roster, it's actually a really good roster, but I think their biggest hole is a real game wrecker on their defensive line, a real playmaker on that line, and I think Latu can instantly come in and be that. I think he's very quickly going to become an elite-level tackler in the NFL, and he already had his last year at UCLA 10.5 sacks, so I think he can instantly come in and be an immediate impact player on their defensive line and solves a major issue. You know, Seattle's biggest issue, I think, on their roster is getting more production from that D-line. So whether it's him or not, I think they're going to be looking for a defensive lineman. And in this scenario, I think he makes a ton of sense for Seattle. With the 17th overall pick, I have the Jacksonville Jaguars drafting Quinyon Mitchell, cornerback from Toledo. So for me, I think he is the highest upside corner in this draft in terms of pure lockdown. I think he can be a monster. In Jacksonville, they desperately need a cornerback number 1. They've been looking for that for years now. I remember back, I think it was either the 2020 draft or the 2021 draft where they drafted C.J. Henderson, I want to say in the top 10, and he was a flat-out bust. So they've really been looking for that guy. I think he's the top corner in this draft. I think it makes a ton of sense to grab him and really start to build up that secondary because the defense does need a lot of work. So getting a NFL day 1 ready starter with extremely high upside at the cornerback position makes a ton of sense for Jacksonville. With the 18th overall pick, I have the Cincinnati Bengals drafting Byron Murphy, the second defensive lineman from Texas. So the Bengals, they're one of those teams that could go a number of different ways with their first-round pick because for me, they don't have that one big glaring hole on their team. I still consider them to be a contending level team when fully healthy, especially with Burrow. So I think, honestly, you know, maybe they go receiver just because the T. Higgins thing is weird right now, but I think they just go best player on the board, best player available. And at this point in the draft, that would be Byron Murphy, the second, who I think would come in and be an immediate impact player in the NFL. I think this guy is going to be a monster. He's an athletic freak and is going to pair well with some of the other Bengals pass rushers. And for me, there's just no one really in this range for the Bengals that makes a ton of sense. So he is the pick here at 18. With the 19th overall pick, I have the Los Angeles Rams drafting Talise Fuaga, offensive tackle from Oregon State. And I know that the Rams, they kind of patched up their offensive line this past year. McVay worked wonders just kind of rebuilding that in one offseason. However, I just don't think this guy can fall down the board anymore. You know, you could have argued the Bengals, but I think the Bengals, similar to the Jets, they already kind of solved their offensive line, at least for the short term, and grabbing Trent Brown, moving Orlando Brown over to left tackle. So I think he can't fall past the Rams here. I think if he was available, the Rams would take him in a heartbeat. Some people think Fuaga has higher upside than Fashanu. I disagree. I just think Fashanu has the higher upside, but Fuaga as a prospect is really good. And I just think the Rams, they couldn't resist taking him here, especially when you have an older quarterback you definitely want to protect in Matthew Stafford. So for me, it kind of feels like a no-brainer if he's available for them. With the 20th overall pick, I have my Pittsburgh Steelers drafting Jackson Powers Johnson, center from Oregon. And this really comes down to one simple fact, and that's as of right now, the Steelers don't even have a center on the roster, so it makes a lot of sense to just grab the highest-rated center prospect in this class. And we know for years now, like 3 or 4 years now, the biggest glaring hole of the Pittsburgh Steelers has been the atrocious offensive line. That's why last year we used our first-round pick on an offensive lineman in Broderick Jones, and I think we continue that trend this year to try and build up that offensive line, and Jackson Powers Johnson is an immediate fit at the center position. You can maybe talk me into a couple other positions for the Steelers, most notably wide receiver after the Deontay Johnson trade. However, I think they're going to address that in the later rounds. You look at how we've developed, our ability to just find diamonds in the rough at the receiver position. I don't see them using a first-round pick. I mean, maybe if Brian Thomas is still available, I don't see him still being available at 20. So for me, Jackson Powers Johnson feels kind of like a no-brainer for center. With the 21st pick, I have the Miami Dolphins drafting Jerzon Newton, defensive tackle from Illinois. So this one for me just feels like it is an immediate replacement for Christian Wilkins. The fact that the Dolphins let that guy walk away for nothing is a complete embarrassment on the Dolphins franchise. And I talked about that a lot of the time whenever he did agree to sign to the Raiders. Like, you cannot just let a productive defensive lineman, big homegrown talent, walk away in free agency for nothing. That is what the joke franchises do. So I think as of right now, their biggest thing they need to address, they don't need to worry about offense. I mean, like, the offensive line could definitely use some work, but I think their biggest glaring hole right now is to try to replace some of that production you lost when Christian Wilkins left. And I think Jerzon Newton can be that, immediately plug into the Miami Dolphins defense. With the 22nd pick, I have the Philadelphia Eagles drafting Terrion Arnold, cornerback from Alabama. And it's clear that cornerback is the number one need for the Philadelphia Eagles. They tried to patch up their secondary and bringing in Kevin Byard, but I think overall their secondary was the worst part of their team this past year, and a large part for their massive decline of this past year. And especially when you go look at the playoff game against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, where Baker was just carving up that secondary. So you need an immediate impact player in the secondary. I think Terrion Arnold could be that. He could honestly, I know I had Quinyon Mitchell already off the board, but Terrion Arnold could still be the best cornerback in this draft. You know, I think they're all kind of really in that same range. We heard that the Eagles are potentially wanting to trade up to land a top corner prospect, but I think if they just stand pat at 22, whether it is Terrion Arnold or some of the other corners, I think this is a really good spot to take him. With the 23rd pick, I have the Minnesota Vikings drafting Cooper DeJean, cornerback from Iowa. So another cornerback. Like I said, I have a lot of corners going around this range. Minnesota, again, another desperate team to upgrade their defense as a whole, but I think their secondary needs addressed. You could talk me into taking one of the remaining pass rushers for sure. I would bet basically, as long as the Vikings don't trade this pick, they basically have to go defense with this selection because their offense is pretty much solidified. Like, their offensive line's good. They have great weapons. They just signed Aaron Jones, so they got a running back. They're obviously, in this scenario, I have them drafting J.J. McCarthy. So your offense is pretty much set So I think you go out there in the draft and look to add a guy with potential superstar upside in Cooper DeJean and really add to that secondary, which outside of Harrison Smith is extremely lackluster. I definitely wanted to get them someone to replace the production of Danielle Hunter, but I don't think there's quite a pass rusher in this range. So I have them just going with the best available secondary player, which would be Cooper DeJean. With the 24th pick, I have the Dallas Cowboys drafting Troy Fautanu, offensive tackle from Washington. We know Washington had the best offensive line in the nation this past year. He was a massive reason for that. And for Dallas specifically, whether they draft Fautanu in reality or not, I would bet money that they're going to draft an offensive lineman here because you just look at the range. There's still a lot of good corner prospects at this range, but obviously, they don't really need a cornerback, so I definitely see them going offensive line here, especially trying to make up for the loss of Tyron Smith. He went to the Jets. I know he was banged up, but when he played, he was still an elite-level player. And Dak Prescott, his entire career in Dallas, has played behind either an elite or sometimes even the best offensive line in football. So I think that's going to be a massive priority for the Cowboys is to keep that offensive line, maintain that steadiness to protect Dak Prescott. So he makes a lot of sense for me here. With the 25th pick, I have the Green Bay Packers drafting J.C. Latham, offensive tackle from Alabama. And similar to what I just said about Dallas, you look at some of the remaining top prospects on the board, it's already positions that the Packers have filled. So I see them just going with Latham here to build up that offensive line. Similar to Dallas again, they lost another really good tackle in David Bakhtiari, which they cut. I know he hadn't played in a while, but when he did play, he was an elite level player. So going out there and trying to add a guy to protect Jordan Love for the next 10 to 15 years makes a ton of sense at 25. With the 26th pick, I have the Tampa Bay Buccaneers drafting Nate Wiggins, cornerback from Clemson. So Tampa's actually a very well-rounded team. I look at their offense. There's really no massive need on the offensive side of the ball. So whenever you look over at defense, really comes down to nitpicking. I think their secondary is really starting to age outside of Winfield. So to go out there and grab Nate Wiggins, a guy who's projected to be a number one corner in the NFL, just makes a lot of sense. Like I said, they're a very well-rounded roster, so why not grab the best prospect still available on the board in Nate Wiggins? With the 27th pick, I have the Arizona Cardinals drafting Amarius Mims, offensive tackle from Georgia. So we know this past draft, they actually used their first-round pick on an offensive tackle as well in Paris Johnson Jr., and I think they just doubled down on that. Now, this is a team that has a lot of holes. This team needs a lot of work, so you could definitely talk me into a number of different prospects here, but I think with this guy still on the board, the high upside that he has to pair him, at a tackle position with Paris Johnson to protect Kyler, for me, is too much to pass up on. When you have a young franchise quarterback like Kyler Murray, for me, it would be too enticing to pass up on this guy who can really help shore up building a top-tier offensive line in the coming years. With the 28th overall pick, I have the Buffalo Bills drafting Adonai Mitchell, wide receiver from Texas, and I already think he made a ton of sense back when they still had Stephon Diggs. I still had them drafting a receiver, but now that he's gone, it's even more important for them to get a playmaker for Josh Allen, and I think Adonai Mitchell is a big-time playmaker. I'm not a Quinn Ewers guy at all, quarterback from Texas. I think he was massively elevated by a great receiver core that he had, spearheaded by Mitchell. And the Bills, I could see them honestly even trading up to maybe look for a guy like Brian Thomas Jr. That's how important I think it is to get Josh Allen a playmaker, because right now, who's the number one receiver on the Bills? Khalil Shakir. I know a lot of people like to downplay the importance that Stephon Diggs had. I know he was dropping off this past year, but losing a big-time playmaker is gonna hurt no matter who you are in terms of production. So I think it's massively important for the Bills to land a guy like this. With the 29th pick, I have the Detroit Lions drafting Kool-Aid McKinstry, cornerback from Alabama. And it was clear this past year the biggest hole on the Lions roster was their secondary. They invested a lot this past year to try and build it up. They brought in Cam Sutton. They brought in C.J. Gardner-Johnson. They drafted Brian Branch. So they really put a lot of effort in trying to build up their secondary. However, I think it failed miserably because their secondary was clearly the biggest hole on the team. And now you got guys departing, and really your only productive secondary player remaining would be Brian Branch. So I think you go ahead and get him another Bama alumni in Kool-Aid McKinstry here, who I think it's a fascinating prospect because I think he has the physical intangibles to be an incredible player in the NFL. But I've seen his draft stock, like he's one of the guys where his draft stock, it ranges the most and in terms of the first round guys, because I've seen him going like as early as middle of the first round, and I've seen some boards even have him drop into like the middle of the second round. I think he goes somewhere in the middle of that. I think Detroit, whether he's on the board or not, I think Detroit needs to address their secondary. The 30th pick, I have the Baltimore Ravens drafting Graham Barton, offensive tackle from Duke. They're another team that could go a couple different directions with this pick. Maybe wide receiver, you could double down on that, although I don't think they're going to do that because Zay Flowers has already emerged as a stud. They used a first-round pick on him this past year. Maybe you want to address linebacker, the fact that Patrick Queen is no longer on the team, but you still got Roquan, obviously. So for me, I think you just go best player available, and in this case would be Graham Barton. Has potentially really, really high upside, and I think it's always going to be important to protect your quarterback when you have Lamar with how he's able to manipulate the pocket. You want to get high-end guys on that line. So again, you could talk me into a couple other positions, but for me, Barton just feels like the best player on here. I don't think he goes past Baltimore. With the 31st pick, I have the San Francisco 49ers drafting Tyler Guyton, offensive tackle from Oklahoma. They have player for player the best roster in the NFL. Their only glaring need is offensive line outside of Trent Williams. You got the best tackle in football on your left side. So I think they're going to go offensive lineman no matter who's here. You need to spend a first-round pick to try and build up that O-line because, like I said, outside of Trent, it is very bad. So that's really their only hole on this team. It's the only one that makes sense. If he's still available, it's a no-brainer to put him on the right side. For the final pick of the first round, with the 32nd pick, I have the Kansas City Chiefs drafting Ladd McConkey, wide receiver from Georgia. So I feel like they have sacrificed a lot of their offensive personnel to really keep that defense intact. When you talk about paying Chris Jones, I know they let go of L'Jarius Sneed, which definitely hurts, but you have at least Trent McDuffie able to step up in there. You got Karlaftis, you got Bolton. Like, they've invested a lot on the defensive side in terms of money and in terms of draft capital. So I think they finally flip back over to the offensive side of the ball and get Patrick Mahomes a really good weapon here in Ladd McConkey, who's really kind of, for me, I kind of think of him as like a Swiss Army knife. He can do a lot for this team, especially he's not going to be like the number one guy. Like the Chiefs, they have a couple good receivers. Rashee Rice, I think, is going to get suspended, but when he's on the field is really good, had a great rookie year. They just brought in Hollywood Brown, and then to add this guy would be, I think he would be dynamite with Patrick Mahomes. So that has been it for my mock draft. You know, I did this video over a series a couple of days, but as of the ending of this recording, it's Monday, and we're only a couple of days away from the draft, so I cannot wait. Make sure you let me know down in the comments what you want to see your team, who you want to see your team draft, some of your top picks. If you made it this far, really appreciate you listening. Please like and subscribe.